Hi, Eric.
Hi there, Jen.
How are you?
Doing great. Doing great. How about you?
Great. Great. You know why?
Why?
Well, because we have scotch.
Oh yeah. Back for another whiskey tips. And we'll get that in the camera here. So yeah, we're back for another whiskey tips with Jen and Eric, and we've got a special guest with us today, Dan Bauer from Surf Pro, not to be confused with Jack Bauer from CTU. Dan Bauer from Surf Pro. Surf Pro is a restoration company. They do a lot of work with design firms and construction companies and project owners and building owners, helping them clean up after disasters and other problems that they've had. So
yeah,
welcome.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I am the person you never ever want to see. I ran into
So are we.
Yeah,
That's weird.
Hey.
you guys know how it feels. I ran into somebody in the hallway here. The first thing he said is, "What's broken?" So
Yeah.
most people say, "How are you?"
Yeah.
So what's up?
So we're really excited to have Dan here because Dan knows all about disasters, which sometimes this little podcast turns into. But he's gonna set us right. He's gonna make everything great today, and he also has some very unusual taste in scotch. Not unusual, but unusual names.
A little different than anything that I'd ever heard of. And I am a self-proclaimed Scotch expert, so it's surprising that we would. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know anything about anything.
Are you going to say the name?
I'm going to try and say
I don't want to have to do it.
I looked it up, so I prepared for today. It's Bonahaven.
Bonahaven,
right? And apparently that's Gaelic for mouth of the river.
Oh,
That's where that comes from.
I wasn't getting through that with a straight face.
No, that's what this is.
Okay.
This is, I'll show the bottle here. Bonahaven, and this is Dan's expert pick. So he comes to us telling us that this is his favorite Scotch whiskey. So
yeah, I learned about this, and I don't know if you guys knew this was a thing, but I went to a class with a whiskey sommelier. And it was to benefit.
Is that what we are?
No, we just drink a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
You have to take a class for this one. You get an ID, you get like a black belt in whiskey or something.
Oh, nice.
And he
Yeah,
introduced
we
me to
do.
this one, and I'm not a whiskey expert either, not even a Gaelic expert. I would not even have pronounced that right. It's a mouthful.
Yeah, I cheated, just so
yeah.
you know.
Oh, good.
Definitely looked it up.
Did a little Google foo.
Yeah.
But I think it's am I allowed to drink it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this in particular is really, I thought, very smooth. It smells great. I think technically you're supposed to say it has a great nose, which I always feel like a jerk saying, but it's a really
It does sound a
pleasant.
little pretentious.
Yeah. It comes with the glasses, right?
Right.
It's just, I think, a really pleasant thing to sip on, as opposed to like a scotch that might have more of a bite or might taste like a shoe. I started drinking scotch because I wanted to buy something my friends wouldn't drink, but I've come to really like it.
Oh,
And so
It's a good
Smart.
tactic anyway, though,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I like it.
So let's see, this says
That's why Eric drinks seltzers.
and some things are supposed to just be between you and me. Yeah?
I'm sorry.
It's unacceptable. So toasted nuts with vanilla and a delicate coastal influence. And we did talk about that before, not knowing exactly what they mean by coastal influence.
Yeah,
It seems a little
what does it coastal
seems a little
influence?
broad in terms of it could just taste like anything. But
Granite.
yeah, let's give this a try
Oh,
here.
I already started.
So Bonahaven, here we go on the hatcher.
Very smooth.
Well, that's
right.
nice.
I feel.
So
I
your
feel a little
sommelier
big.
was right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Eric Eustace, he knows his stuff. You should have him on.
Yeah, we should.
And yeah.
We should actually get somebody on here that knows something. We have a podcast called Whiskey Tips. We know nothing about
That's not about the whiskey.
it.
It's about the tips, right?
Yeah, it's about the
It's
tips.
about the tips.
So-
Always about the tips.
What tips do we want to talk about today?
Yeah, so we brought you in not just for your good taste in scotch, as it turns out, but to talk to us about water damage, water claims, the things that you see that to get destroyed by water, how damaging it is. So talk to us about water.
Well, I know one actually whiskey fact related to water, specifically water that can destroy you, scotch.
Mhm.
I think it used to be called, or whiskey was called aqua vitae, which is water of life.
Oh,
Fire water.
fire water, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a different thing.
That's a totally different thing, but
Shots of that later.
it is, yeah, it's not the only type of water that can destroy you that we're talking about today. We're talking about water damage,
Mhm.
which is something that I basically see every day of my life, which I never thought I would see in my life. I used to be in luxury brand marketing. It's a very different field entirely. I'm like that water damage restoration is something people actually need because it's so damaging. Like your average, so if we're talking like water damage, right? If you're thinking of your house, it's probably gonna come from like a burst pipe or something, or your dishwasher overflows.
Right.
If we're talking like a commercial building, it can be anything from a serious flood event, a hurricane, a sprinkler head break, a toilet overflow. All of these things can really compound and be really damaging. I think people don't realize how costly they can be. Like your average basic, like residential claim like that costs somewhere in the ballpark of like $13,000. When you get into big commercial buildings, like a high rise or a government building, that can get anywhere, on average, like $45,000 to 6-7 figure damage claims.
Yeah.
And not only that, but they cause an incredible amount of disruption to people.
Yeah.
So if you imagine, I'd say a manufacturer who has a flood, they're great, partners in a way because they know how many dollars they're losing by every hour that they're shut down because something like that. But something like a hotel that has a flood, they know how many rooms they're losing. There's a lot of these different secondary factors that come in, but it can be really just horribly disruptive. And I think the worst thing about it, or the thing that really causes it to get as bad as it can be, is the fact that it's such an emergency. It's such like an urgent thing to deal with when it happens, and a lot of people don't necessarily treat it with the urgency that it deserves, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So that's sort of the moral of my story most of the time is like, do something about this.
Do something immediately.
Yeah.
So it always tends to be the case that, the basement floods or the pipe bursts when you're on vacation or you're out of the house or you're out of the business. And just as an aside here, when do pipes burst? Well, when it gets very cold, when the heat is turned off.
When you're on vacation.
When you're on vacation, when the heat is very low. But as an aside, because this is an insurance talk too, there are vacancy provisions in your policy. So if you leave your business, you leave your building, you leave your home, and you leave it unoccupied, unattended, heat turned off, you may be up against a lack of coverage altogether for those kinds of water claims. And we've seen that happen quite a few times.
Yeah, we see that happen when firms change locations. They still, own the prior location, but they've occupied the new location, and that kind of lingers for a little bit. We saw it during COVID.
I was just going to bring that up. We saw a ton of that. Spaces that weren't occupied or maybe seasonally occupied, people weren't walking through, and you can have huge amounts of damage, and people don't even know for a long time.
Sure.
It's those ongoing damage that water constantly creates. I think that was a good point earlier, that people don't really think about the extra damages. You think about the initial cause of the water intrusion in the first place, but all of the consequential factors that go into it, those follow-on damages that just continue and keep happening until, like you said, somebody actually does something to stop it and fix it.
It's funny. It's one thing people don't really understand about water is how fast that happens. There's a certifying body that they're the people who, they do the research and they come up with the standards for water damage restoration. According to them, water that sits, say it's a clean water source, say it's a toilet supply line or something, if that sits for 72 hours or more, it's considered as contaminated as raw sewage.
Wow.
That's how fast that happens. And it needs to be treated as such, which is, in the course of 3 days, a much more invasive, disruptive form of restoration than just, say, extracting a puddle and calling it a day. But that's how fast water can become contaminated. And that's not even talking about microbial growth, mold, things like that can, those sort of secondary effects that can happen very, very quickly if something's not contained or stabilized.
So that's just the water sitting there. So we're talking about, your long weekend situation, your COVID vacancy issues, right? Your someone moves into another space, those kind of lack of attention to that space where something like that happens. But what about the other human factor? So I walk into our office building and I see that water is coming from somewhere, I'm not really sure where, there's a puddle on the ground. What do I do?
Just what should you do right then?
What should I do right then? Do I panic? Do I
You should-
leave the building? Do I just turn
Definitely
around?
panic. Yeah, go home.
Right, I just-
Pretend you didn't see it.
I didn't see
Open up
it.
a bottle of scotch.
Yeah.
That sounds right.
I'll give specific advice in a second, but the main thing I would tell people is that you should do something. The worst thing you can do is panic and hesitate, or sort of a higher level version of hesitating, which is deciding it's somebody else's problem and that it's not your responsibility to deal with it. All those are generally bad ideas. That sounds really easy to say on paper, but that is what happens in a lot of situations. People don't do anything. They don't know what to do, so they choose to do nothing, for reasons that are sometimes semi-rational and sometimes it's just pure panic.
Right.
If you do find yourself in that situation where there's water coming in, the most important thing you can do, the thing we tell everybody as soon as they call us, the thing we ask them is turn off the source of the water. And you would be shocked at how many people I talk to on a really daily basis who call us for restoration work, and they're standing next to a pipe that's still gushing water.
Mhm.
People don't really think to do those sorts of things in a really panicky emergency situation. So number one thing is just you want to stop more damage from occurring. So you turn off the source of that water. If you say have a hole in your roof or something, you try to get that tarped up. One most important thing is to stop more damage from occurring. After that, you're just trying to get the water out of there.
Sure.
And there are really simple ways to do that. You don't need a bunch of equipment or a bunch of training to start. Somebody with like a push broom or a squeegee in a dream can make a huge difference when something like that happens, just because they make a decision to try to do something, keep
Right.
water away from valuable areas, it get as much of it out as possible. I believe it's, and I may misquote this, so please, internet, don't fact check me, but it's about 1,200 times more effective to remove water versus dry it. So if you had a flood in this room and it were to soak up the drywall, it would be 1,200 times harder to dry it once it's wicked into that material versus just like throwing down some towels and getting as much of it out as you can.
Right.
So turn off the source, do whatever you can to contain and remove that water, and then call for help. Oh man, you're going to be better than 99% of the people that we talk to on a daily basis who just don't do those two relatively basic things.
Yeah,
So-
you said earlier that we might be surprised that most people still have water gushing when you show up. I'm not sure that I would be. I don't think anybody in my house even knows how the water gets to the house.
Mhm.
So if a pipe burst and water was gushing in, I'm pretty sure that it would just stay that way until somebody else came
This
to.
is- yeah,
To
great
panic call
topic.
to you.
Yeah, great topic for your next family meeting.
Right.
Blast.
Let's learn about where the water comes from today.
Let's talk
That's not
about
the
water.
score.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So fun fact, another fun insurance fact, you have a responsibility to
Yes.
mitigate additional damages. So if you have a hole in your roof, get it covered. And now maybe you're not physically capable of getting up on the roof and getting that covered.
The
But
insurance company isn't gonna expect the 90-year-old single person to get up on the roof and lay a tarp, right?
right. But there are outfits like your own
Mhm.
that will come out and do that for you. And in most cases, as long as that loss is a covered claim, that's going to be a reimbursable cost
Right.
to
In other-
mitigate that loss.
In other things, we talk about the reasonable person standard. You mentioned that earlier. It applies to just about everything, right? You're not gonna-
Absolutely.
You're not gonna just sit there and let the rain or snow continue to pile up inside your house because there's a big gaping hole. You're gonna do something about it. You're gonna try and stop it and mitigate it. That's what the insurance company expects.
Right, and even if you've got, I've been really waiting for the ability to redo these hardwood floors, it is not the time to just allow that water and snow and hail to come in, and do more damage. Just so you can get a little extra out of the insurance company. Now is not the time to do that because they have very smart engineers
Mhm.
and very smart recon folks who can come in and identify pretty quickly that there were things that weren't done when they should have been done.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we've dealt with more and more, and this isn't to complain necessarily, but one thing we've run into is there's a big difference between somebody who is being reasonable and someone who's trying to be savvy about the situation. You can reason yourself into a circle, trying to outsmart, if you think kind of everybody's out to get you, right? There are people who will have water gushing into their house, and before they will even start to extract it, they want to make sure that an insurance adjuster gets out there, and they'll wait days and days for that to happen, because they want to ensure that that loss is going to be covered. Or B, they think they're being smart because they want to wait until they can get, say, 3 estimates on the work. And now, of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting to know what you're getting yourself into. But what happens is if you wait a week potentially to get all of that information back before you even touch the loss, all you've done is potentially undermined your status as a reasonable person, and B, cause so much more damage. Mold, for example, microbial growth can form within really 72 hours, sometimes faster, but definitely 72 hours. You have all that much moisture in there, you're going to see that come in. And a lot of times that is a totally separate thing than that water loss. That might not be covered. You may have totally shot yourself in the foot trying to be savvy and waiting and gathering information and whatever, what have you, as opposed to just dealing with the problem when it happened, like a reasonable person would.
Yeah.
Patching a hole in your roof, getting the water out of there, and then figuring out who's going to pay for it.
Right.
Water is like the great equalizer. I think you said that before. So it happens to everybody. So whether you are renting an apartment, you are leasing business space, you own the building that your business is in, you're the landlord, you're the homeowner. It's under construction, it's a project under construction. Water will affect you. This isn't a mostly residential issue or a mostly commercial or mostly municipal. This is a widespread type of issue, and it has to be attacked immediately. So as soon as something happens, it has to be attacked. From our point of view, so we deal with a lot of architects and engineers, of course, but we have, a whole range of construction entities and so on that we work with. So this is a really big deal. So we see it from both the business owners, commercial space owner point of view, where there are losses that happen because of water infiltration, one way or the other, whether that's broken pipe, backed up sewer, roof drains backing up and coming over, into moonlights and such. So we've seen that happen. I've actually seen a situation where another roof on a building in a city was pumping water off of their roof onto the roof next door and created a claim situation for that building neighbor. So lots of ways that this can happen, but then we also see it on the project side. Where we've got our clients, architects and engineers, that are working on a project, and there is an exposure one way or the other to elements, to water, on either the building that hasn't been properly enclosed or to building materials. And I know you've got some experience with that.
Absolutely. It's funny how a couple of poor decisions by somebody, it was single person sometimes, can lead to these gigantic issues. I was going to say clusters, but I don't know if that's appropriate.
This is a podcast called Whiskey Tips. It's fine.
Difficult situations, right? Complex situations.
Yeah.
For example, we fairly recently did work for a large hospital system, and the core issue was there was a contractor working on the windows of that hospital, and they took a window out, and they didn't have time that day to replace it, and they just sort of covered it up with a moving blanket. And that night, temperatures got under 0 degrees, as they sometimes do in Buffalo, and pipes burst, and I believe it was on the 7th floor of that hospital, all because that enclosure wasn't done correctly. It wasn't insulating the building, and that caused 7 floors of water damage in a building that can never shut down. That ended up being the responsibility of the construction company to deal with that. All fingers were pointed to them because of the decision of a single employee. And it was the sort of issue that disrupted their operations enough where everybody's sitting at the table, not necessarily pointing fingers. I think everybody was pretty civil about it, but assigning blame, figuring out what to do about it. It's one person making a mistake, and it becomes this huge ordeal. And that happens more often than you would think. One single instance of human error or oversight, and it becomes this huge deal.
Yeah. In my head, as sort of a dorky insurance person, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, oh my God, limitations of liability. I'm thinking all these
Right.
other contractual issues that could,
Flow down.
point the blame, that should be going in one direction to somebody else, finding the deep pockets. Was there a design firm on site that day? Should somebody have seen it? Did somebody see it and not say something about it?
Right.
All these other factors that go into it when a claim like that happens, like you said, that one instance, that one bad decision by somebody, is always somebody else's fault and something somebody should have seen but didn't. And, it just, it becomes a revenue sharing type of a thing.
Yeah, and we've seen that happen on plenty of occasions, right? Whether it be by poor dispute resolution methods that are employed by all the parties, and the finger pointing and the splitting of the baby kind of thing. So it's just a cost sharing exercise.
Yeah. So what happens if the person that made that decision, and I'll just go off on this tangent because we already started down that road. Person that makes that decision is the employee of a subcontractor who has a contract in place that limits their liability to $50,000. And this was what you said, 6 figures by the time it was all said and done. Those are the things we talk about constantly. Right now, we're not talking about contracts today, but these are the issues that we think about when this stuff happens, and who's ultimately going to end up holding the bag for that.
Right, or, the thought that's probably going through several of our design professional friends' heads while they're watching this is, well, this clearly isn't a design issue.
Mhm.
Well, if it's a big enough problem, they're gonna be looking to you to get your documents, to see whether you were on site, they want your notes.
Did you have CA services in your contract? Should you
Should
have
have
been
seen
there? What did that
this?
say? Was it at the owner's discretion? Did the owner decide in that moment that you should have been there that day? All those things
Yeah.
that, it comes back to.
And I
So
think
it's messy.
when I do trainings for people, one of the things that I'm asked to speak to is potential for subrogation when something happens.
Yeah.
Mhm.
How do you train your frontline staff to document things, to keep an eye out for things, take photo and video when something happens, with the explicit intent of basically passing the buck to someone else? People, even end users of buildings, even the custodial staff, people who are really on the front lines of these things, are being trained and taught to look for liability the moment something happens. So the potential for an issue to reach someone who maybe never thought they would possibly touch them is only going to become greater.
Mhm.
And then there are waiver of subrogation provisions rather in contracts that could be impactful. If there are mutual waivers of subrogation and there is a building policy, property policy in place that no parties will subrogate against the other, the hospital could be holding a claim that is just monstrous for an error that they didn't, that wasn't their fault,
Mhm.
right? So if they have a waiver of subrogation, a mutual waiver between them and the construction company, they could be left with this monstrous claim
Mhm.
on their insurance for something like that.
Right. And I mean, especially when talking to organizations of that size, they have these huge deductibles they have to pay out.
Yeah.
And everything sort of is kind of anchored on that deductible. Very quickly, you can pass that deductible when something gets that serious. We recently worked on a sugar factory explosion that was, again, whose fault is this? Do you guys know that sugar particles, when they are ultra fine,
Are highly explosive.
highly explosive? Yes. I can't believe, have you dealt with this before?
No, I just read a lot.
Oh.
Super dorky.
I'm very impressed. They are in fact super combustible. Yeah,
Jen
so,
taught the Unabomber everything he did.
Sweet.
now I'm thinking about the Unabomber, thinking, what would I look like in a hoodie?
You look like the Unabomber.
Yeah, I guess everybody does. Anyway, yes, they're highly combustible. Say a piece of machinery on, I think the 4th or 5th floor of the place leak overnight, and all these particles are floating around in the air. So middle of the night, explosion, blows out all the windows, blows out all the sprinkler heads, and you have basically 5 floors down to the basement of not just water, but molasses water coating this entire factory.
Wow.
Whose fault is that?
Yeah.
And how
gets
fast does that
messy, so to
become,
speak.
Against their pretty large deductible?
Yeah.
How fast does that add up? Because everything's covered in sugar and goo.
Mhm.
So every shipping pallet you have to go through, it's going to cost me $7 to clean it and $6.50 to replace it. It's a lot of accounting, and that adds up over time. I mean, I think that these sorts of issues when you're thinking about a claim, when you're thinking about a deductible, people have no idea how fast that can really, really add up and become a monstrous claim, like you said.
Well, and I think situations like that are part of the reason that people will naturally try and bury their head in the sand when something
Right.
happens, because they are such large numbers that we're talking about, and it is such catastrophic situations and huge claims. You think about it from the perspective of a design firm that's involved in, maybe that factory was under renovation and there were designers involved in it. The hospital example that you gave, if something like this happens and everybody just kind of wants to be very quick to disclaim their responsibility for it, rather than come to a resolution, trying to see how we can come together and fix this and mitigate further damage like we talked about before. And so I think when it comes to, what are we supposed to do in these situations? If I'm a building owner and I've got either a new build that's sort of halfway done and I've got this issue that happens, or I've got a renovation project and, there's a water issue, a damage issue that I have to deal with as the owner, I'm going to immediately be looking to my consultants, my representatives, to kind of help me figure out what happened and mitigate the issue at hand. If one of those consultants were to just kind of dip out on me, I think in my mind, we're creating a situation where I'm probably going to be more inclined to maybe pointing the finger at that person, right? Instead of the person who's really coming to my aid and saying, all right, this is what we have to do. We got to call ServPro. First things first, we got to get these guys out here. We got to get this fixed. We'll deal with the liability and all the other stuff after the fact. Let's get this resolved right now, right? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times that doesn't happen.
So I think that brings up a point, something we were talking about before we started, about owner expectations.
Mhm.
And I think you said owners are generally pretty reasonable when things are going well, but the nature of a disaster like that creates unreasonableness, right? So a panic, just like anybody else would have.
Yeah, if when something happens, everybody is very quick to more or less figure out why it's not their fault.
Mhm.
And that can sometimes be warranted and sometimes not. But you run into situations similar to what you just described, where people want to figure out the liability. And they want to make that airtight, and they want to do that before they touch anything. And that can be a really bad situation. We work in situations like that where there are attorneys involved. People want to sit down at the table and assign blame before they will even respond to an event. That in itself is sort of unreasonable that people do it because they're so afraid of getting burned.
We see it all the time, sort of a self-preservation instinct people have.
It's natural.
Yeah.
And people are naturally risk averse. They don't want to be left holding the bag. They don't want to make a bad decision. But I will tell you, 99 times out of 100, that sort of raw desire for self-preservation ends up backfiring because you just make everything worse. And unless you can somehow get out of that situation scot-free, you've probably shut yourself foot.
Yeah, for sure, because you still have to work together, you still have to finish this project, especially if it's a disaster that happens mid-project, there's still a lot to do. So you said airtight, you brought up something else before that I think is really important for design professionals here.
You're really good at the segues today.
Like a
segues.
segue queen. So you said something about the airtightness of green building and energy efficiency. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I am a great fan and advocate for sustainable, resilient building practices. And I know people, and shout out to BOMA Buffalo on the board here, and I've met lots of people there, people who are involved with, say, writing the standards for LEED and who advocate for LEED and well buildings, things like that. So this is not meant to besmirch any of that, but every single mold assessor that I know is sort of going like this, seeing it all happen, because those buildings are built to be energy efficient, and many times that means more or less airtight, or as close to airtight as you can get. That lack of air circulation makes the likelihood that mold and microbial growth will develop like astronomical. You just have no airflow in these buildings, and you've got all these cavities where something like that can happen with just a little bit of moisture, where if you do have any sort of water event, that's probably going to follow very quickly. Like I said, within 72 hours. And even when we're dealing with, when we spoke about this a little bit, new builds, residential and commercial, we see very often those buildings are not fully developed, they're not fully enclosed. There's a big storm or something, or there's some sort of a water backup issue. Mold can develop very quickly because they are more or less airtight. And it's immediately the responsibility of the construction company, the developer, the designer, whoever's kind of responsible for that shell at that point, to deal with that in a very, very thorough way. And it just happens more and more and more. It's a great time, I guess, to be a mold assessor. But it can make it really tough because you've got these, frankly, great, the building standards themselves are great and obviously great for the environment. They lead to these sort of secondary effects that nobody's really figured out how to solve for yet. There are great systems that people have in place to detect water intrusions, great systems to detect changes in humidity, things like that. But nothing that compares to the basic antimicrobial features of a drafty building, like your house that was built in 1902.
Right.
It creaks every time a breeze comes through.
Right.
As opposed to something that's new and totally sealed up.
Right. Right. Interesting. So you could be mid-construction on a new build, have just a slight variation in humidity in a crawl space, for instance, finish and enclose that building, not realize it, and open that door up 2 weeks later and have a major mold problem.
Yeah, and it can really be that fast.
Yeah.
The X factor is moisture. Humidity
Yeah.
shoots up. August right now, our most humid month, at least in the summer. This is the time for those sorts of issues to happen. We've seen them more and more.
So anyone from the design side or anyone who's involved in CM or CA services should be really thinking about that as they're, looking at the progression of a project, whether or not things were left out to the elements, whether or not things were allowed to be open when they shouldn't have been.
Sequencing issue.
Sequencing issue, fast track projects when, you've got design just barely keeping up with construction and the kind of havoc that can be wreaked from those situations. So I think even though when we think about damage to materials, damage to buildings because of water intrusion, we think about contractor issues, materials issues, installation issues, not always the case. If you have CA responsibilities, if you have responsibilities for design that's just keeping up in that fast track project, sequencing issues, those kind of things, you could have some responsibility, or at least find yourself involved in it should something come up later.
And if we want to talk about specific scenarios where you guys have mentioned people are all sitting at the table, what do you call it, splitting the baby? What a horrible little phrase. Municipal.
Solomon, right?
Yeah. Nice. Municipalities, government buildings is probably where this situation is the most severe, at least in my experience, because they're sort of, those organizations are built to move kind of at a snail's pace and figure this stuff all out.
Okay.
As thoroughly as possible before they'll ever make a decision. And all the while, those problems are getting worse and worse. So if you're working with those sorts of organizations, I would say government buildings and schools primarily, they're not built to make quick decisions and mitigate damage. And so if you find yourself sitting at the table trying to assign blame and figure out what to do about something like that, it's going to be a long time. It's going to get worse. It's going to be expensive. And if there's any one iota of blame they can assign you, they'll probably find a way to do it.
Oh, absolutely.
Much love to my government and municipal partners, but that's typically what happens. It's a real
and I think
situation.
I think that's pretty common too, because from the owner's perspective, when something does go south, usually they don't care where the money comes from, and there's a lot of time spent trying to figure out whether this is a design issue or a construction issue, or where does this really come from? And that's for the insurance companies to hash out, and the attorneys to hash out. The owner, they don't care. They could all come from the architect, it could all come from the GC, as long as they get made whole. And I think that kind of lends itself back to the discussion we always have about contingency budgets and things during the construction process. And disaster restoration costs is not something that's usually factored into that. I think it probably should be. We get ourselves in this type of situation, and it's always going to come back to, well, this has to be somebody else's fault. And really that is born out of, well, the owner doesn't have the budget to deal with this. It could be nobody's fault. But the owner doesn't have the money for it, and we're gonna make it somebody's fault, right? And so from, a designer or a contractor's point of view, that's a risk, a hazard, a liability, something that they should be considerate of when they're having those conversations about contingency budgets with their owners, to the extent that they are, and we all know that doesn't happen as often as it should.
Sure.
The good alternative, though, there to moving something along quickly is making sure that the right insurance products are in place.
Right.
So making sure that buildings under construction or renovation have the proper builder's risk policies that are inclusive of the kinds of losses that are, are likely to happen or most likely to happen, and then also high enough to cover the potential damage and debris removal, et cetera, and replacement of those materials. So making sure you have the right person as a risk manager, having somebody assigned there, making sure that coverage is appropriate for what they have, and that it's the fingers are pointing in the right direction, if you will.
Right.
With consistency in contracts, will make all the difference in terms of getting that type of thing resolved very quickly.
Right.
And a lot of schools in particular are required to follow certain protocols, so they usually do. Municipalities, depending upon their size, maybe less so. But
private projects, you're gonna run into a problem.
Yeah, private projects, you're gonna run into more problems that way, but the good news there is that your owners generally have more latitude in making decisions and moving things along. But if if you're ever concerned about those kinds of things and you don't feel like the owner has a good risk manager, we've got people that do that.
It is really important. I've seen the statistic around multiple places, and it's usually kind of a spectrum, but anywhere from 25 to 50% of businesses that suffer some sort of major disaster that would cause disruption, closure, et cetera, never reopen.
Yes.
And the exact number, like I said, I've seen it all over the place. It's usually attributed to FEMA. I've seen similar studies by the American Red Cross, but it's for the reasons you're describing. It's planning, it's prep, it's having somebody who knows how to manage that risk and react.
Right.
As opposed to just trying to figure it all out after the fact and really struggling.
Yeah, and so we're just gonna start ticking off, the disasters. I mean, it is whiskey tips for a reason. We drink whiskey to talk about these uncomfortable subjects, but water damage is one of them. I can think of 20 off the top of my head. So having
and if we're including the unseen water, the humidity issue, that accounts for a significant amount of claims that we see, on the HVAC side of things, and it's a lot of it.
HVAC, mechanicals, the engineering claim that you talked about earlier with a school, an engineering failure causing millions and millions and millions of dollars in damage for water intrusion.
Yeah.
The kind of thing that you don't know there's a mistake until the mistake comes to life in the form of a flood. Right. Is really, really dangerous.
And that was $21 million to reopen that school, and it still has not happened. And it's because of sudden rainfall related to Hurricane Ida that came in through the ventilation system, and that was that. It was in the course of 3 hours, and that school stopped being a school.
Wow. That's So water is extremely damaging. It is very intrusive. It can penetrate all kinds of areas and materials. It can really create a lot of damage, a lot of havoc. Thank God people like you are around to help, or people like me who maybe don't know. I know where the water shut off is. But
thank God there are people that know the good things to do with water also.
Cheers.
Yeah, that's salud.
That brings things full circle for us. So a few sips in, what do we think?
Delicious.
Yeah,
I like this a lot.
Yeah, it's almost gone. I didn't even realize until now.
This was a great pick.
Yeah, great.
Great pick.
Thank you guys for having me and for serving me this delicious stuff.
Hey,
yeah, well, thanks for choosing this one, and thanks for joining us today. We always like having guests on that bring some interesting perspective to the table, so we appreciate that. And Jen, as always, really, really great job.
Hey, thanks. You too. Great job out there today. So proud of you.
It's been another Whiskey Tips with Jen and Eric. Thanks again to our special guest, Dan Bauer. And we'll see you next time for our podcast that's not really a podcast.
and see you next time.